So just before thanking everyone for inviting me and saying a few of those words, I wanted to just take a minute to recognize the place that we are and the land that we're on. I think because particularly I was asked to give a talk and reflections today about a place, about Montreal, I was really conscious that I'm doing it in a place that's also someone else's place, and that the land that we're on today is colonized and was cleared of its original inhabitants. And we're talking today really about 3 languages of the place, and none of those languages are the original languages of here. So before starting, I thought to just recognize that the territory called Teotihuacan, the unceded territories of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples, I wanted to start with that. And I wanted to also then thank Judith and Catherine and Sherry and everyone for being here today. It's a really interesting project and collective. In my head, I say it something like ta'am or something like that. And since we're talking about language and kind of playing with language, I thought that's when everyone can think about, what are other ways we could play with the name of that collective. And I wanted to just acknowledge and thank a few colleagues who really helped me think about the kinds of reflections I'm going to talk about today, even though most of them couldn't be here for all these different reasons. But Rula Jordi, these are people some of you also know, Dima Ayoub, Rosalind Hampton, and my colleague Yasmin Nashabi, who came down from McGill today, who've really helped think about the things I'm going to talk about with me. And I wanted to also do that as the way of starting to say that there's something about translation that is interesting, because it can be a very lonely and very solitary process, because you do a lot of translating by yourself. Well, if you're me, in your apartment with your computer, but it's also a process that's really collective. And it's also a process that isn't about just you and your computer, in a room, but it's about all the interactions that you have with people, all the discussions and all the language and the ways in which languages come into your head, and then you work with them. And so I wanted to really start by thanking and acknowledging the people who make, my translation and the work that I do as a translator in Montreal collective. And, since it is a collective that also organized this event, I wanted to underline that. And I'm really sorry that I won't be able to be here for the day of activities because of this time in the semester. So I also, when I run away, it's not because I don't want to be here, but just the timing of the actual event. I'm really not used to talking about myself, and that was kind of what I was asked to do. So also bear with me on that, because I find it a little weird. It's not my thing. But I'm kind of excited because I get to talk about the projects that I'm doing. And I'm working on several right now, in addition to finishing the semester and marking all the students' papers. But the reflections that I put together today about translation is related to a book that I'm working on that I'm calling Breaking Broken English. And the idea I'm trying to work with is about breaking, what a break is and what a break can be. So this idea, the kind of theoretical idea, I'm putting on my timer, the theoretical idea that I'm trying to think about in relation to language and translation is around that concept of breaking. So that's why I made up the title of the talk, Traducteur, Casseur, with the dot next to the E. And I was kind of trying to play a little bit with ideas about, the famous Traduttore, Traditore idea, trying to kind of play with a bit of the sound consonants with those words, but trying to think about how we might reconceptualize the idea of being a traitor or being someone who betrays. And I wanted to move that into thinking about us as translators as maybe people who break things or break with things or work with language so that language doesn't sound broken when we change it, or maybe so that it does sound broken. And kind of put that out there as an idea we could think about. So I wanted to talk about what broken language is. So that's a metaphor we have in English to talk about language. We say, broken English or broken language. And it exists in Arabic as well, right? Arabi mutkasra, right? What people used to tell me when I started learning Arabic, right? That's how you talk. But we don't really have that same exact expression in French. It's something, we express that in a different way. So I thought I could talk a bit about those theoretical ideas, but then also some practical ideas, because that's what I work on, the connections but also discontinuities between the theory of translation and the practice when you're sitting down to actually do it. And so So that was one thing I wanted to start with. And the other was that I put my title with the .e, right? The Traducteur with the dot and the Casseur with the dot with the e. Also in the sort of similar spirit and thinking about language, to talk about what in English we call the gender neutral language, right? So I was talking with students about this the other day, because when I was the age of the undergraduates today, using so-called gender neutral language in English was kind of a big deal. Like, it was like professors sometimes would mark you wrong if you said she or he, right? Like, why do you need to put she in there? And today in France, we're seeing a similar kind of conversation about what are the ways that we could include a gender neutral way of expressing things by putting the dot with the e as a way to refer in general to people, right? Rather than referring to people in general as the masculine. In Quebec, of course, we do that often. There are the other ways to do it with the capital E or with the dashes, right? There's these different ways that people choose to do it. But I thought, that's why I sort of thought to use a word that's like not a real word, right? A neologism in the title as well, rather than to talk about traductrice. Like, what if we became traducteur, right? Just a suggestion, something to think about. I mean, it's not something that I'm really deeply familiar with, so if people are interested in talking about it, we can talk about it in the discussion period. But I thought it's interesting to highlight this idea about language, this way of maybe expressing things, because I think for me, working in Montreal, and as a person who works with language in Montreal, that's that idea of how to express the gender neutral language in French, and listening to people talk about that in other kinds of contexts I work in, right? I work in an English language university, so at McGill we're not having lots of long conversations about whether we put the dot between the E in French, right? But in other contexts that I participate in Montreal, this can be a big conversation, and how should we do it? And should we put the capital? Should we put the dot? Should we not do it? When we make up our acronyms for our collective, should we have it be the same in English and French or a different one, right? Like, those are kind of conversations people have in Montreal all the time. So I wanted to think about these kinds of questions around language in relation to what do we do when we're translators, right? So the idea I wanted to throw out at the beginning is what does it mean when we are working as translators with the goal of creating a smooth translation, a seamless translation, the translation studies people say, like, a domesticated translation, a translation that feels really easy, right? And what does it mean to try to disrupt that and do a different kind of translation, what the translation studies people say, foreignizing translations, to make your language strange, or to make your language rough, or to make your language broken? And how does that work? How might that work in the context that we're in? So if we're in Montreal, right, we're in a city where there's a lot of experimentations with language. People love to play and experiment with English and French, right? We just had the mayoral election, and there's posters with jokes and bilingual jokes, and this happens all the time, right? But when we enter a third language into those conversations, because we're working with Arabic, all of a sudden, those third languages don't have the same place. Right? We're not allowed to play with them in the same way. The third languages have the shaky place, the unstable place. They look broken when we try to enter them in conversations about English and French. So I wanted to think about the idea of using or reflecting or producing broken language, and what does it mean to break things in either opposition or in contradistinction to things being broken, like doing it on purpose, or just things just being there broken. And this is what I think might be productive in some of the kinds of examples that I'm going to give today. So I've been trying to think about that in terms of what I have done as a translator working in Montreal, because that's what I'm supposed to talk about, translator working in Montreal. So I was an Arabic to English translator before I came to Montreal. And I had done a few translation projects at that point. I had translated all of the collected political writings of a very well-known Francophone Lebanese nationalist writer, Michel Chiha. People have heard of him, from French into English, which is part of a postdoctoral project that I was working on. And I had also translated a novel together with a co-translator Maher Barakat, to translate a novel by a Syrian author, Muhammad Kamal al-Khatib, into English. So we translated Hakadha Ka Nahar, the novel from the 80s, into English as Just Like a River. And just after I moved here, I finished up a translation of a second novel that was a runner-up for a big prize. So that was Iman Hamidan's Tut Barri, Wild Mulberries, is how I translated it. So because that translation got a little bit known, I got asked to do a lot more translations. And so that's sort of how it took off. So it was kind of, I was doing it before I came to Montreal, but it was sort of when I came here that this one translation I did got relatively known. And then, once you start being known, then people ask you to do more and more. So I started working more and more on studying translation at the time, because the more I started doing these translations, the less satisfied I was with the translations I was doing. So people kept saying, oh no, they're really good. And I kept thinking, but I'm not happy with them. I don't think they're really good, that kind of conversation. And so I wanted to understand more about the complexities of the processes of the languages I was working with and how they were connected to each other and how they weren't connected to each other. So Arabic and English, mainly a little bit French. And I began to see increasingly as I worked more and more on this, and this is really with the help of colleagues studying translation of Arab women's fiction. So I'm thinking about people like Amal Amire, Mohja Kahf, Dia Abdu, Marilyn Booth, that the politics of translation were tied to both theoretical and practical, but also political questions. And this made me more interested in really getting into that study. So as many of you, I'm sure, appreciate, the questions and issues related to translation that has to do with Arabic, right, translations to and from Arabic, are significantly different than the translations between English and French, right, which is mostly what people in Montreal study and care about and work on. So the focus on words and wordplay, which of course we care a lot about in English and Arabic as well, is very different than the context, the politics, and the power that we have to confront all the time when we are trying to make ourselves understood as translators working with Arabic. So as I kind of worked more and more on this, and particularly in translation theory, I kind of started connecting it more to the work that I was doing with language, and that's all Arabic, English, and French, but particularly language mixing. Right, so I have done, I have been studying language mixing in literary texts, thinking about, growing up between languages, speaking multiple languages at the same time, putting languages into sentences together. So I had been working on this in the Lebanese context. So those of you who know the Lebanese context know that that's what people do a lot, right? It's like mixing in one sentence lots of languages. So moving to Montreal makes a lot of sense because it's another place where that's what people do, right? It's just an everyday thing where you start a sentence in one language and you end it in another, or you put in words and nobody kind of pays any attention to it. It's just normal, right? And so these are two contexts, right, where that's really true. So this was a really good fit for me when I came here because this is what I was studying, and I'm kind of a language mixing buff, and I find it really interesting. So I was working on a book about French language fiction and the way in which Arabic is used in French language fiction at that time. So it was really fun to come here and be living amidst another context where people do the same thing, right? So what I thought when I came to Montreal originally was, so I was moving to this place where all this language mixing was happening. And if you think of Montreal as a bilingual or a trilingual or a multilingual city, it is, right? You always find it, no matter where you just walk into a shop or anything like this. So I think that living in that kind of atmosphere is part of how I've developed the theory and practice of translation. My translation work hasn't really focused here, and that's for a number of reasons. Again, a lot of you will be familiar with, and we can talk about more, partly because there is really not a lot of interest or publishing here of Arabic language fiction in English. That's not, it's not centered here. The publisher I work with is a small independent publisher in the United States who has one of the largest lists in the world of Arabic fiction translated into English, but and it's not far, right? It's just over the border, but it's not actually based in Montreal. But of course, I do most of my work here. So that's where I'm coming from. That's a bit my background. So coming back to thinking about the Traducteur, Casseur idea and how it fits in with the work that I'm trying to do. I think part of the idea of trying to use breaks or breaking things to not make them broken, but do something different, comes from being in Montreal. I believe this. And I think this idea that language can break down, break into, break through, or fix things that are broken, right? The way I started thinking about that in relation to Montreal for today was thinking about when I first came here. And what was like forming me to become a Montrealer, right? Because I've now been here like 15 years. I didn't grow up here. But somebody working with language. And the thing that sticks in my mind a lot are these political moments of protesting things. So this is what I'm going to bring out today. So when I first moved here right before the US war on Iraq in 2002. And I spent a lot of time working with the students in the student strike in 2012, and also in the period when the government proposed the Charter of Values. And these moments were really, I think, formative in thinking about language, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why. With a friend and a colleague, we worked on a piece together about the idea of breaking. And that is being published, let's say January. They said December, but I doubt it. And what we did in there, they asked us to write a manifesto. Right, so I love this idea of writing a manifesto. So we sat and we worked on it together. And we used in this writing the idea of manifestation. And what does it mean to participate in a manifestation, or a manif, like people say in Montreal? What does it mean to make something, what we would say in English, manifest, right? To make something clear, or to demonstrate something, or to make something visible, or to act on something, right? Is there something within that concept that we could think about? So I went back and looked at 2002 and remembering walking with kind of 200,000 people on a day that was minus 20 degrees to protest the war in Iraq. And something that stood out to me, because I moved here from New York, where I had been doing the same thing in English, was the way in which the chants that people chanted were different, right? I mean, they were in French. And thinking about ones that mixed English and French, or had different kinds of rhymes, and how do you think about rhyming in a different language? Can you rhyme in a language that isn't your own language, right? That's a harder thing to do than just come up with translations that are words. How can you make words fit together? So as, the kind of classic Montreal protest chants like solidarité avec le monde entier, right? Repeating the sounds in order to make the rhythm work so that the rhymes fall in the right place metrically. And if you've ever participated in large demonstrations or walked in the streets with many, many people, the chants stay in your head. You go home and you still remember them in your head. And I think the way in which those kinds of sounds and those kinds of rhythms can repeat help to form our language, right? They help to form the way that we express ourselves. So when I was thinking about the experience of chants ringing in our ears and how that becomes part of the linguistic repertoire, for me, I think I have to connect it to the student strikes of 2012. So for me, probably a lot of you were here at that time. It was a political protest experience for me in which I was very implicated. And I walked, or as we say in Arabic, right, I went down in the streets to more than 100 manifestations. And I went to most of those manifestations with my 5-year-old son. And so, that's someone who's forming language at the time, right? One of his first words that he took from the strikes, he thought that the word that people were saying was solidarité, right? So if we think about like what, how we hear words and the way that we put together ideas. But I think that it was really interesting for me in participating in that student movement that there was a lot of cultural and linguistic translation being done that is close to our work as Arabic translators. I mean, if you think even of the way that the students at one point framed the movement, calling it the printemps arabe, right? And the kind of consonance of sound with printemps arabe, right? So the movement itself was playing with an expression and a word that was connected to the Arab world. So they used also that image, the iconic image of the fist from Egypt on the 25th of January, and sort of the idea that young Quebecois people were using an Arab protest or an Arab protest movement or a revolution as a role model. It was something that I think a lot of people found really interesting or potentially even moving at the time, right? Because there were all of these kind of young Quebecois people looking to the Arab world for inspiration. And, I had just come back at that time of the student movement from Lebanon. And so this idea of sound solidarity, sonic solidarity was in my head a lot when I came back here. And I was thinking about kind of going from Lebanon to Egypt at that period, which is something that I did and visited, and seeing graffiti on the walls and people still in their encampments outside in Tahrir Square and so on, and people being really excited on the streets, right? So everyone remembers those chants, right? Because those stick in your ears for like الشعب يريد إسقاط النظام. اعتصام حتى يسقط النظام, right? So one of my son's first words when we went back to the Middle East, where he had been gone from being a baby, was اعتصام. Right, so that's a word that he came, back to Montreal with, and sort of people here were like, "Oh, that's interesting," the word for you to have learned, as a 4-year-old. But I think that at the same time I was thinking about all of that kind of the sounds and the words and the ideas that are connected to them. I was also remembering, and this is another parallel, right, where we have with Montreal, the lines of riot police outside the National Museum when I took my 4-year-old to go look at the mummies, right? And, the really violent repression that happened just after the excitement, and the way to think about how to make that revolution actually something transformative, in that case in Egypt. So I think that thinking about the idea of the sound solidarity or the sonic solidarity, printemps arabe, was something that I found really exciting or potentially moving, but it also had these limitations, right? And very, so at the time that this was going on, I'm somebody who is identified as Anglo in a French strike, right? At the end of the day, the strike and most of what was happening there happened in French. And I was really interested in that and in the kind of possibilities and limitations of the translation that was going on, right? Because I was working with students at McGill where very few people speak French, right? And very few of the students who I was working with were able to access the French. And so if you think about it, I don't know if people were aware of the group of people who set up the website of Translating le Printemps Arabe, right? Which was a really interesting project to translate masses of the kind of French language media that was being produced at the time, so that there would be this conversation, right, between these worlds that are supposed to be separate. And, again, we can evaluate, how successful it is, but, I had students who were addicted to reading this page, right? Because they would be able to find out everything that's happening in the sources that they normally can't access. It was like this moment where people were actually kind of really bridging over those gaps that we know exist here. And there was a lot being circulated. So, that is something that I wanted to put out in relation to this experience, but also thinking about, how that expression, the one that I'm talking about that brings that kind of sound solidarity between Arabic and French, that's lost in the English, right? That goes away in the English because then we have Maple Spring, and Maple Spring doesn't really do much, right? It's nice, right? And so so then we start talking Quebec Spring or something like this. It's almost completely lost. Or even the idea about what spring means in French in Quebec, right? Printemps. It's different, right? It has a different kind of meaning. So I think that when we think about, in particular, I'm really interested in particular, and this will connect back together, I promise, in the possibilities and the excitement of sonic solidarity and the power of it, but also its limitations, right? Because, what happens in Quebec, I mean, we all remember this, or most people probably remember this, is that right after the student movement and, the Liberal government falls, there's this, moment that many of us, let's say, considered a betrayal when the Charter of Values comes in and is the next kind of major thing that's proposed by the government. And so the residue of that, right, we're seeing it now. So now we have Bill 62 banning the niqab in, so many public places. This moment of kind of excitement and possibility about a future, so quickly kind of falling away. So I know a lot of people who didn't necessarily appreciate the sonic solidarity of Printemps Arabe and Printemps Arabe, and I know I'm a person who likes wordplay, so I think, okay, maybe I'm different. But I think, it's interesting to think about the evoking two things that aren't exactly alike, right? So I appreciate the wordplay and the symbolic association and that willingness to break the boundaries and the borders, right? The breaking that we're used to. But there's a limit to the solidarity that's based only in sound, right? That the words, if words aren't connected to some kind of an action, they don't do something. And I think for me, that was a really big lesson about the limits of that kind of solidarity, that when words that are rooted only in thought or only in play and aren't connected in action aren't necessarily going to be able to do something. And so the lack of mobilization against that charter, and indeed the support of it by many people who were very, very, who we were with in the streets, was a very vivid demonstration to me about the need to connect the struggles more deeply, right? To promote those notions about how things that we believe in have to be linked together, and not just arguing for our individual causes at an individual time, but that when we are making arguments for justice, we must link them together, right? So similarly, when we're thinking about translating words or translating sounds, right, we can make them resonate, right? We can make plays, but we have to think about ways to root them in deeper ideas to make them count. So I'm thinking about, how we can do some of that building together. So what I'm trying to work on in the theory and practice is trying to come up with deeper explanations through translation, so that translation isn't just superficial, and to make ideas penetrate more deeply than only the words and the sounds. So making us understand the things that aren't understandable, or translating the things that aren't translatable, right? Can you translate rhymes that aren't there, right? Can you translate sounds? Can you translate concepts? So that's what I was trying to do with the idea of the traducteur casseur, to bring back the translator as someone who's actually trying to break things. Mutekassira, right? That was my one. So I'm going to come back to that in a second. But I wanted to connect that idea about the person who does the breaking to the casseur, because this also was something that was really important in the Printemps Arabe, and that we saw a lot in the media, that the students who were involved in this protest were seen as lawless youth, right? We saw that a lot, right? The criminalization of the young people, or the infantilization of the young people in the media. This was particularly true in English, right? The idea that these young people who were marching in the street were faced by the riot police, on a nightly basis. I was working with young people at the time and students, and to me, calling those people mindless or just out there to break things seemed ridiculous. I mean, I talked to students, they were so deeply engaged, believed in changing society, were really committed to what they were doing. And this idea that sort of the students were lazy and they were trying to skip school, it just seemed absolutely ludicrous, right? But the idea of the students as rioters, right, or disruptors, I think also bothered me in other ways, because I knew they weren't just disrupting things to be for no reason, right? And I have a quote from one of the students who wrote up some of her experiences in the strike about translating between English and French that I think illustrates what I'm trying to say pretty well. she was talking about it to her, so she lives here in Quebec, and she was talking about it to her English-speaking mother who lived outside the province. And she said about the word casseur. She said, I remember the first time I heard the word translated into simple, logical English coming from my mother's mouth and landing perfectly in my gut. Rioters. She said she'd heard it on the news. They aren't rioters, I told her, they're casseurs. But what do? The mother. Break things. Well, so they riot, she said. No, there's more to it. I felt it. There's something in the air here, something coming. I explain it to other Anglophones like this. A rioter is, and can only ever be, part of a riot. But a casseur, well, a casseur is part of a manif, part of the physical manifestation of something. So here she's distinguishing between breaking and rioting as something fundamentally different, that there is a physical manifestation of something bigger than yourself. And so this idea that what a casseur does is to break something is what I'm trying to think about as what maybe the traducteur can do, right, in my broken French definition, of what might be able to be made clear. So I was thinking about it in Arabic a little bit, right? To thinking about breaking Arabic. Do people remember at all the campaign in Lebanon called Khidi Kasra? No? Too young. You remember. Okay. So this was a campaign that was done in Lebanon. The slogan was Khidi Kasra wa haraki al-umur, right? Shake it up. And it was a feminist intervention into language that was started. So it was a visual project, and it gave people kasras, and you were supposed to go around the city and put them in public places, like on billboards and on signs, to feminize the language. Right? So, and the campaign went on for a certain amount, I don't actually remember how long it went on for a certain amount of time, to draw attention to the fact that we have a masculine default language, right? So sort of similar to putting the dot between the E in the title, of the talk or in French. This was a big campaign that was meant to highlight this and ask women and men to think about the language that we use, take some of that power, and to really work on changing things by changing language and by being aware of language and by using language, right? So it was this kind of idea that we're supposed to kind of internalize, but it was also a visual representation with actual physical kasras that people went around and put. And people did different things with them. You can look it up on the internet and see. Some of the project was quite interesting. But my other example that I wanted to give from Arabic also comes from Lebanon, because there is a really interesting parallel and a nice language example from the so-called garbage strikes in 2015, which had just started when I landed on my sabbatical in Lebanon, making the beginning, more and less pleasant different ways. So I went down for those strikes as well. And there were so many really memorable plays with languages and chants that, you just can't, how do you translate, something like Fahita Tawu Irhalia Mashnu, right? If anyone remembers that or knows the Lebanese, kind of garbage strike scene, they're funny, right? And they don't kind of translate over. Or of course the slogan that became so well known that they came up with a really brilliant translation for Talat Rihatkum, right? If people remember that one, which got translated as "you stink." Right, which was a very kind of perfect translation of everything that was going on. But at that exact moment, Lebanon lived through something really similar to the casseur of the student strike. If this might be kind of specific, but there was a really construction in the media of the people who were supporting the protests, calling them Za'aran of Khandak al-Ghamiq. Right? So the Za'aran are the ones causing the problem. And so the rest of us really shouldn't go down into the streets because, somehow we're going to be kind of polluted by the presence of these kind of undesirable people. So in the context of a rebuilt Beirut downtown, if people are familiar with the kind of project that was done there. You think about the exclusion from the main public spaces of many, many inhabitants of the city in order to create an international center for, for capital and only the wealthy. But middle-class Lebanese are being kind of discouraged from mixing, right, with other people, somehow to convince people that having the trash removed from the street isn't in their interest, because the only people who would care about having trash removed from the streets are somehow the Zaran. Right? So how do you translate Za'ran? Right? I mean, is Za'ran is it a rioter? A Casseur? Right? I mean, it's being used in the same way, right? It was being used in the exact same way in the media, but that's a different kind of a term, right? Because we say it to kids, like as a kind of like, oh, he's naughty, but like he's kind of, gonna grow up and be a man, right? So it's like, it has that same kind of resonance, but yet it's a different kind of a word. So coming back, to thinking about what we can do as a translator, I've been trying to argue a bit, to think about ways in which we can translate and work with words, ideas, and concepts that don't really translate, right? That there isn't an obvious translation for, and think about ways that we might do that we could see as breaking down or breaking up, breaking the conventions or breaking with the conventions. So one of the suggestions I wanted to leave with today, and it's one of these ones that works different in practice and in theory, but I wanted to put it out there anyway, is thinking about if we could use techniques in our translation work, which might be similar to or resonate with the kinds of techniques used in literary works by Arab authors in English and French. So, I work kind of extensively with texts by Arab authors in English, and I know that also in French, many of the things that are appreciated in both are their creative uses of language, especially the Arabic language. So, I mean, very likely many people who are here today, but also a wide range of authors, Montrealer Rawi Haj, هيام يارد, ربيع علام الدين, Dominique Ede, Sharif Mejdalani, Asiya Jabbar, Ahdaf Swaib, Susan Abul Hawa. I mean, we can go on and on and on with the list of these authors. We have a lot of people to choose from. If you've ever thought of translating them into Arabic, if you've ever done that like little experiment for yourself at home, you see it's not so easy to do, right? When you have this kind of play with language, it's not something that's so obvious. But I think that the techniques that they're using to write their stories, part of what makes them compelling and actually draws in the audiences to emphasize and indigenize their text, breaking down assumptions, breaking down stereotypes, breaking with conventions, often happens in the ways that they break language. They use language that's unexpected, that rings of Arabic. So there's lots of ways that people do this, right? People transcribe but don't translate Arabic. They translate and explain it. They use a lot of different kinds of techniques. But they somehow use a broken or breaking language that is looked down on when we translate. So it's something I could talk about a lot, but concluding here, it's not always an effective technique. It doesn't always work. It can be really orientalizing. It can be self-orientalizing. It can be distracting. It can be, there are lots of ways that it doesn't always work, for sure. But I think we're at a point of maturity in a lot of the texts where it's too simple or insulting to say that that's what most of the authors are doing or that's what all the authors are doing. I think we have so many counterexamples that show us ways in which this kind of play with language can be done really effectively. So if we accept that as a premise, I'm wondering if we might be able to think about ways to make these kinds of experimentations less taboo in literary translations. I mean, apart from, really honestly, a couple of words left in an original Arabic that you and your 5 levels of editors decide are untranslatable, that they make you forcibly tether to a glossary or to a footnote or something like this. More or less, you're not supposed to have these experimentations in your translated texts, right? It's considered a taboo. It's considered something we're not supposed to do. I only work in English. I can talk about it from now until tomorrow in English. I understand from colleagues that the same, or if not more, is true in French. Right? That, that what you're kind of supposed to be doing in terms of linguistic experimentation is relatively boxed in. But it's not just the editors or the copy editors who don't let us do that, right? It's also ourselves, and it's also the way that we think about what translation does and the critical community that we work with. So, to extend the metaphor, well, I won't extend the metaphor too much, but in my opinion, I think that the production of Arabic English and probably Arabic French translations as well are very constrained by concrete factors which don't allow us to achieve our potential as a creative community. I think as creative community of translators, that we have a relatively conservative way of approaching literary and translational creativity, particularly in relation to experimentation with language. Okay, so, I made a point of kind of trying to give you a sense of how I came to translation and have been building towards the idea in thinking about working in a bilingual and trilingual and multilingual city and kind of the mixing of languages, to wonder if we might be able to think about what kind of breaks, what kind of ways we could work towards, or call for, or think about as translators. Right? So we have a lot of challenges. So it's not to say we don't have a lot of other challenges. And, if people want to talk about this in the discussion period, we're facing a lot of specific challenges as translators of Arabic. But I think that in the context that we're in, which is challenging, it is charged, and the political atmosphere is demanding us to produce certain kinds of translations of Arabic texts to meet certain kinds of needs or perceived needs in marketing and dissemination, that we need to really think about our translations themselves. And I can give lots of examples if people want, but I do want to underline politics today. I used my own political involvements and observations here in Montreal to underline how our contexts really inform our linguistic practices, right? They inform our theories too, but also our practices. And that a city like Montreal can really enrich the kind of multiple contexts for politics, and we need to kind of think about and give input to it as much as it gives it to us, right? Like, we are here to kind of shape what Montreal is, right? Because we're Montreal too. So I think that's really important to think. So the political analysis, I was kind of ending thinking about us being Montreal too. So, so what does the shab yurid, right? Like what is it, what's it going to be? Like, what is it that we are going to say that we want or we demand, or to use, the khidi kasra slogan to, harrak al-umur. So that's it. Thank you.